details, but I understand that they do have insurance in place which would cover them in an eventuality like that. And you imagine that negotiations with that insurance company have been taking place behind the scenes over the last few weeks. And if they're able to do that, then they can return money to the ticket holders and also still bring in money themselves. And a lot of that money goes to the Lawn Tennis Association, who run tennis in the UK. So they may well find that they're able to have a budget for the 12 months ahead as well.
Russell, thank you very much for joining us. It's going to be very strange not hearing the Wimbledon Tennis Championships on the BBC World Service this year, but we await to see what the announcement is from that meeting later this week. Thanks for listening today. More sports news every day on the BBC World Service. Join us for Sport Today, 18:30 every weekday. It's been great to have your company. Goodbye for now.
Sports World is a BBC Sport production for the BBC World Service.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, keeping you up to date and informed. The coronavirus is changing life for all of us around the globe.
India, with its 1.3 billion population, is anxious and nervous.
Here at the BBC World Service, we're bringing you regular roundups.
We are all in this together.
All the latest medical information and reports from affected areas, here on the BBC World Service. Hello and welcome to the BBC World Service, where we're making some changes to programmes you hear to make sure we can bring you live news, reports and discussions around the coronavirus pandemic and other stories. Stay with us for the newsroom, and then it's the food chain. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
BBC World Service, it's 16 hours GMT. This is Oliver Conway with the newsroom. Italy and Spain, which account for half of all deaths from the coronavirus, say they could be reaching the peak of the outbreak.
I believe in 1 week time, 10 days maximum, we will see a significant drop of positive cases.
But an American health official says up to 200,000 people could die in the US. India's Prime Minister apologises for the 3-week curfew there, but for the poor, the suffering goes on.
This lockdown is a disaster for people like us. All the shops have stopped giving us credit. We can't even feed our families.
We have the latest. And the commentator with no sport to cover.
And now they go, Olive away first, but a problem with Mabel's ball. That might cost her now, having to play catch-up. Both settling quickly into rhythm. You can see the contrast in styles.
So who won the doggy dinner time stakes? First, the news.
Hello, I'm Aaron Safir with the BBC News. The US government's leading infectious disease expert, Dr. Anthony Fauci, says at least 100,000 Americans will be killed by the coronavirus and possibly up to twice that number. Some cities, including New York, have warned that they may soon run out of medical supplies. Steve Jackson reports.
The United States has recorded more cases of COVID-19 than any other country, 120,000. But so far there have been fewer deaths than in some other nations, just over 2,000. Dr. Anthony Fauci is one of the world's most respected voices on disease outbreaks, and his warning in a CNN TV interview was stark. The numbers are going to go up, a lot, and millions of Americans are expected to catch the virus. His comments come as some cities, including New York, have warned that they may run out of key medical equipment such as ventilators and surgical masks. America, like many other countries, is facing daunting challenges ahead.
Officials in the 2 European countries hardest hit by the coronavirus pandemic, Italy and Spain, say they believe their countries are near the peak of the outbreak. Italy's Deputy Health Minister said he expected to see a significant drop in cases within 10 days. There have been more than 10,000 virus-related deaths in Italy. A Member of Parliament, Lia Quartapelle, said it was vital not to lift restrictions on movement too quickly.
If we don't fight the virus, we cannot restart normal economic activity. So we need to be really careful with reopening. I think it's right to start thinking about reopening, but after Easter. And then we will see how to reopen, whether to do selective reopening or regionally or economically. We start thinking about this.
Spain has recorded 838 deaths, but new infections are increasing at a slower rate. Saudi Arabian state media says the authorities have seized more than 5 million medical masks that had been illegally stockpiled during the coronavirus outbreak. Sebastian Usher reports.
Arab countries across the Gulf have taken extremely stringent action to try to prevent coronavirus, with several going into lockdown before much of the rest of the world. Penalties for breaching restrictions have been severe too. Now, two apparent attempts to stockpile masks have been broken up in Saudi Arabia, with 4 million confiscated from a facility in Jeddah and more than 1 million others from a private store in Hale, north of Riyadh.
India has told its state governments to seal their borders and quarantine hundreds of thousands of migrants from other parts of the country in an attempt to contain the spread of the coronavirus. The country is in the midst of a 3-week nationwide lockdown, but the measure has resulted in a mass exodus of migrant labourers from cities. World News from the BBC. The impact of COVID-19 is continuing to be felt across sub-Saharan Africa. In Benin, President Patrice Talon said it would be difficult to enforce prevention measures because people were too poor to cope with them. In Nigeria, the petroleum regulator has ordered oil and gas companies to reduce their offshore workforce to try to stop the spread of the disease on rigs. Gun campaigners in the US have welcomed moves by the Trump administration to classify firearms as essential after many stores were shut because of coronavirus restrictions. The Gun Industry Association said people needed to be able to protect themselves during the pandemic, which has led to the closure of non-essential businesses in several states. Pope Francis has joined the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres in calling for an immediate global ceasefire so that the world can focus on tackling the coronavirus pandemic. The Pope made his appeal at his weekly blessing in the Vatican.
Mi associo a quanti hanno accolto questo appello.
I join all those who have accepted this appeal and invite everyone to follow it up by seizing all forms of hostilities, encouraging the creation of corridors for humanitarian aid, openness to diplomacy, paying attention to those who find themselves in situations of great vulnerability.
Voting is taking place in Mali in a long-delayed parliamentary election, hours after the country reported its first death from coronavirus. So far, few people in the capital, Bamako, have turned out, saying they're afraid of catching COVID-19. A plane carrying medical personnel has burst into flames during takeoff in the capital of the Philippines. The authorities at Manila International Airport said none of the 8 people on board survived. The flight was on a medical mission to Japan. BBC News.
Thank you very much. You're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with Oliver Conway. Between them, Spain and Italy account for more than half the total deaths from COVID-19. In the past day or so, both have reported more than 800 fatalities. Spain's total for Sunday was its highest daily total yet. Italy hasn't yet released its figures for Sunday, but on Saturday it recorded its second worst death toll of the outbreak. So both looking pretty bad. However, Italy and Spain believe the worst may soon be behind them. They believe they are experiencing or nearing the peak of the outbreak, and so the numbers should begin to drop in the coming days. Italy's Deputy Health Minister, Paolo Sileri, says the lockdown is starting to work.
Obviously, when you test more, you may find more positive people, and this will explain the increased number of positive that we found over the last 2 days. But I believe that we are living in the peak of this epidemic. I believe in 1 week time, 10 days maximum, we will see a significant drop of positive cases.
Well, our correspondent in Berlin, Damien McGuinness, is monitoring the whole of Europe for us today. Damien, I mean, obviously their hopeful cases are going down. Do they have evidence?
Well, the evidence so far, they say, is because in some regions there's a slowing down of the infection rate, but I think a lot of it is mostly hope. Obviously, also, the restrictions have been pretty severe, so there is very little social contact from what you can tell by most people abiding by regulations, and very few people are hitting the streets in Italy and Spain as well, where they're just tightening restrictions again for tomorrow and telling people not to go to work unless they are key workers. So the fact that the restrictions are so severe would indicate that ordinarily infections would now start to go down. But there's no evidence so far that that will definitely happen. We have had periods over the last few weeks where that hope has been also there, and that hasn't happened. So, you know, we can only really pray that that will be the case. But so far, what we can say is the restrictions are really being ramped up in many countries. What we're seeing here in Germany is that, interestingly though, although the infection rate is one of the highest in the world, at almost 60,000 now, the death toll is actually very low, under 500 still. Now that tells us a few things, and that really shows, as we heard from that Italian minister just now, that the rate of testing is crucial, because the more you test, as the WHO experts have said, the more we can see who has this virus. What Germany has done is they have tested people with few symptoms or hardly any symptoms, and what that means is that they could nip it in the bud more successfully, and it shows that elsewhere in other countries the actual real infection rate is much higher than we really know. So the other question is really the debate about how long this lockdown would last, and that's the real debate here in Germany, because there are voices now calling for the restrictions to be eased slightly to at least help the economy. Angela Merkel has said no to that, and so what we're going to see in Germany and most of Europe, at least until the middle of April, and probably longer, we're going to see these restrictions carry on for quite a while.
Damien, many thanks indeed. Damien McGuinness there, live from Berlin here in the UK. The government latest news conference has just said that UK life may not return to normal for 6 months or longer. For those who have lost loved ones and for the billions struggling to cope with new controls on everyday life, it is a difficult question to hear. Could this pandemic have been prevented with better planning or more resources? Well, just last year, the former Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland, warned that countries were not prepared for a major health crisis. Her report for the World Bank was presented to governments around the world. She spoke to the BBC's Johnny Diamond.
What we have now is a warned catastrophe, because we saw that there was a big alarming gaps in the preparedness of the world, and we found compelling evidence that there is a very real threat of a rapidly moving, highly lethal pandemic of a respiratory pathogen, with the potential to kill tens of millions of people worldwide and wipe out nearly, around 5% of the global economy. Those were the things we already wrote about, and we told the world and the leaders of the world the 7 action points that they needed to take. Now, I understand we are now there. It's already happened. So, less than 3 months after our report, the coronavirus started spreading in China. We know that the preparedness that we needed to have, and that was part of our action plans, they are not there in most societies across the world.
So are there things that you can draw from your report that you would press upon governments or organisations to do now, or frankly, is it too late for any of those lessons to have been put into place?
Well, it's certainly not too late.
Right.
However, we have to deal with the fact that we are already in this now, which means really putting a lot of emphasis on mobilizing quickly the funding and the attention, using the possibilities of each country to get the production of the needed equipment, even using, legal systems that are not in regular use, but in this kind of wartime time can be used to get quickly to the needs met.
Do you believe that coordination of approach between countries, which is rather lacking at the moment, would be preferable?
It absolutely would, and it is, of course, partly happening. I mean, we have our global institutions, we have the World Health Organization strongly involved. It has to be funded quickly and totally, according to the needs, to help coordinate. This is something we are in together. The whole world has to mobilize and fund the necessary responses, and it is starting to happen.
Dr. Harlem Brundtland, formerly of the WHO. India's 1.3 billion citizens were given less than 4 hours' notice before they were confined to their homes on Tuesday night to tackle the coronavirus. The lockdown hit the poorest the hardest, with little or no food supplies and suddenly no job. For those living hand to mouth, it was a disaster. Now the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has apologised for the hurt caused to hundreds of millions of people, but said he had no alternative.
खास करके मेरे गरीब भाई बहनों को देखता हूं. Especially when I look at my poor brothers and sisters, I definitely feel that they must be thinking, what kind of Prime Minister is this who has placed us in this difficulty? I especially seek their forgiveness. Possibly many people will be angry at me for being locked in their homes. I understand your troubles, but there was no other way to wage war against coronavirus.
India has reported 25 deaths and about 1,000 cases of coronavirus, but experts fear the real number of infections could be far higher. Our reporter Rahul Tandon has been speaking to people across India. I asked him first why Mr. Modi had felt the need to apologise.
I think because you have to look at the scale of the situation that the country and the poor are having to deal with. You know, most countries are dealing with millions of people just generally. India's dealing with 100 million migrant workers who earn a few dollars a day trying to eke out an existence so that they can feed their families. Now, of course, all that money is stopped to them because that lockdown means they can't work anymore as maids, as construction workers, doing the jobs that people need to have done in the city. And there are growing concerns amongst the government themselves here that some of these people may now starve. I mean, many of them don't have bank accounts. They don't have any savings at all. To give you an idea of some of the problems they're facing, here's Rania. She's a maid in Delhi. She now has no money.
21 दिन का जो लॉकडाउन हुआ है, हम लोग रोज कमाने खाने वाला है, हम लोग का
This lockdown is a disaster for people like us. We're daily wage labourers. We earn about $2 a day. Now that has stopped. How will we survive? The price of food has gone up, and all the shops have stopped giving us credit.
And there are millions of people who are in the same situation that Rania is in at the moment.
And some of them are feeling they have to make very long journeys to get back to their home villages.
Yes, the government has announced this huge package, like many other governments have across the world, of direct transfers into people's bank accounts, of getting them food. But a lot of these migrant workers just feel they'll be much safer in their villages. But the question is, how do they actually get back home? Many of them, as you say, are walking. I mean, I've spoken to people who've been talking to migrant workers who are walking 400, 500 kilometers with the few possessions they have on their back as they try and get home. I know somebody who spoke to a 90-year-old woman who said, I'm going to go home 500 kilometers walking with the rest of her family. She doesn't know if she's going to make it. The government's trying to tackle this problem, but the scale of it is huge. One economist said to me, we could be seeing the largest movement of people in India since the partition.
And of course that has huge health implications. You mentioned the $22 billion bailout from the government. What else can they do to keep these people safe?
They want people to stay where they are if they're possible, but if you're a daily wage earner, you might even be kicked out of the accommodation that you have because you can't pay the rent. I think they're trying to set up camps at the moment for these people, also camps for when they get home. And some villages are getting home. The villagers there are saying, we don't want you to come in case you bring the virus with you. Prachi Singh is a health economist based in Delhi.
The movement of migrants has to be first contained. We need huge manpower to track these people given the sheer size of Indian population. But more importantly, if the migrant population ends up in tightly packed places, which are effectively high density places, then the risk of spread of this disease is huge.
You could just hear there the scale of the problem that the country is facing with. They're trying to deal with it. The question here is how do you balance millions of lives with millions of livelihoods?
Rahul Tandon on the situation in India. A quick bit of news from Italy. They've just released their figures for the latest 24-hour death toll. They say that 756 people died in the 24 hours to Sunday. 756. That is down on the previous day of 889. So more than 100 less. The Saturday figure was their second highest total. But it does look, if this continues, that death toll is slowly going down in Italy. You're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. Still to come, we look back at the life of the Polish composer Krzysztof Penderecki, who's died at the age of 86. First, Aaron has our headlines.
The two countries where the coronavirus has caused most deaths, Italy and Spain, say they believe they're at or near the peak of the outbreak. State governments in India have been told to seal their borders to migrants from other parts of the country to try to control the spread of the disease. And the leading infectious disease expert in the US has warned that the coronavirus could kill up to 200,000 Americans.
Meanwhile, the New York governor is giving a news conference. If anything comes out of that, I'll bring it to you before the end of the programme. Different countries have seen different rates of compliance to various coronavirus restrictions, but police in Israel have been criticised for failing to stop a mass gathering at the funeral of an ultra-Orthodox rabbi. They've now been told to do better. The number of coronavirus cases in Israel has risen to more than 3,800. 12 people have died. I asked our Middle East analyst Sebastian Usher to tell us more about what happened at the funeral.
There was a large number of people who came out then, ultra-Orthodox. This was a prominent rabbi. It wasn't as many, this is what the police say, as there might have been. It could have been numbered in the thousands, but at least 400 or so people were there. And obviously this is very much against the restrictions on mass gatherings, but Israel, like other countries, has imposed. So there were big questions asked when the pictures started to circulate online. Ministers in the government essentially accused the police of not having done their job, saying, that all gatherings have to be stopped and there can be no exemptions. There is talk now amongst ministers in Israel of imposing a much more stringent lockdown on areas where the ultra-Orthodox are in Israel. In response, an ultra-Orthodox religious leader has called on his followers not to pray in public, well, actually ordered them not to pray in public. So it's a big thing, but I remember Israel at the moment is going through another one of its very convoluted and difficult attempts to form a coalition government. That's happening at the moment. Benjamin Netanyahu and his rival Benny Gantz. And to form a coalition, you need the small ultra-Orthodox parties. So they exert, a great political power, even though they may not be that highly represented in the Knesset.
Okay, let's look at the wider Middle East, because Syria has reported its first death from COVID-19, and, well, that could be a terrible place to have an outbreak.
Yes, I mean, this is the first official confirmation. So far, Syria has only said there have been a handful of cases. Now, there have been lots and lots of rumours and reports from various parts of the country that there have been cases, but in some of those areas, for example, Idlib, where the biggest numbers of people, 1 million or so, recently been forced from their homes and the worst fighting's been happening, there hasn't been any testing as yet. And that's been the same story in Yemen, which still hasn't reported a case, although it seems very likely that there are cases there. But again, that's a country which is in such a dire state. Again, great fears over what might happen there. And in Libya, another one of the war-torn Arab countries, there have been efforts made by both the current warring factions to try to impose controls, restrictions and curfews to prevent the spread. But those three areas are all seen as absolute potential powder kegs of how the virus could further spread and the lack of control that there would be if it did so.
Sebastian Usher. As more countries introduce lockdowns, millions in China are starting to return to work as the communist authorities slowly lift strict control measures. So what can we learn from those who spent weeks in quarantine in China? Luna Ha is a teacher in Beijing.
All of a sudden, I'm isolated in this small space with myself, with my own thoughts. I find reading really help. And I started to read those really big books that I didn't have the courage or commitment to read, before. It's really important to reach out to people. When I'm left alone with my thoughts, my mind is restless. So I guess talking to people, and it gives me a feeling of I'm still connected to this world. I learned a lot of new aspects about myself that I didn't really find before this. And then I guess it also gives me a new perspective to look at life with more gratitude, I guess. Before all this, we never really thought how life could be like without shopping malls, without pubs, bars. But now it kind of makes me reflect on how we took all this for granted. I think the sooner you accept the fact that you're going to be stuck at home probably longer than you think, the better that you will mentally adjust yourself to the routine. This, however long this lasts, this will come to an end. We'll get through this.
Lunaha in Beijing. Away from the coronavirus for a moment now, and one of the world's leading contemporary classical composers, Krzysztof Penderecki, has died at the age of 86. More details from our arts correspondent Vincent Dowd.
Born in 1933 to a middle-class Catholic family, Krzysztof Penderecki grew up in a Poland where music was officially required to avoid the experimental. By the early 60s, the cultural climate had changed, and early works such as Threnody to the Victims of Hiroshima was anything but polite and reassuring.
My avant-garde was really very avant-garde. We were rebelling.
Penderecki was aware that some of his works were too difficult, even disturbing for many music lovers, but he contributed to the scores of avant-garde Polish films. In 1973, his chilling music was used in The Exorcist. But probably the biggest exposure came in 1980, when Stanley Kubrick, always obsessed with music, decided Penderecki would be the right composer for The Shining.
Asked me to write the music for his Shining. I said no, because I said I'm busy. But I gave him some suggestion of the pieces that he's supposed to listen to, and then he did and took this music.
Krzysztof Penderecki's compositions included opera, symphonies, and much else. By the end of a long career, he was widely performed around the world.
Vincent Dowd and Krzysztof Penderecki, who has died at the age of 86. Football has, of course, been suspended across most of the world because of the coronavirus pandemic, but games are still being played in Belarus. In normal circumstances, the Belarusian Premier League would rarely get a mention, but it's attracting attention from foreign fans as one of the few places they can get their football fix, as Will Leonardo reports.
Relief has come from a surprising corner of the continent. Fans starved of the game are turning to Belarus for their fix. There, the Premier League is ploughing on regardless, and stadiums remain open to supporters. New followers are getting used to names like Smoljevici, who were beaten 1-0 by Islich in the capital Minsk today. With the newfound attention comes money. Sports networks from 10 different countries, including Russia and India, have now signed broadcast rights with the Belarusian FA. A federation spokesman has called it an unprecedented situation. Belarus still has fewer than 100 confirmed coronavirus cases, but there's been criticism of the decision to keep going as normal. That's the President Alexander Lukashenko saying it was better to die standing than to live on your knees while taking part in an ice hockey game yesterday. He added that he hadn't seen any viruses flying around the chilled stadium. The authoritarian leader has previously suggested vodka and farm work as a way to prevent COVID-19.
Well, Leonardo, staying with sport, thousands of athletes, sports stars around the globe have been unable to compete or play matches because of the pandemic. But spare a thought for the commentators as well. At this time of the year, the BBC's Andrew Cotter would normally be covering the Masters Golf Tournament, Six Nations Rugby and boat race. All of them have been cancelled. So how is he filling his time? He posted this on Twitter with the caption, "I was bored."
Well, how fitting that it should come down to these two. Olive in her familiar black, 5 times the champion. Mabel, the rising star, winner last year. You can see how excited they are, but also feel the tension.
Get on with it.
And here it's in the crowd as we near the start of this final. And now they go, Olive away first, but a problem with Mabel's ball. That might cost her now, having to play catch-up. Both settling quickly into rhythm. You can see the contrast in styles. Mabel, heavy tail use, happy to be alive. Everything's amazing. Olive more steady, wasting little energy. Very much of the old Labrador school, eating's a serious business. Mabel seems just a little sluggish here. Perhaps more was taken out of her by the worm medicine she was given last night than we thought. But Olive, focused, relentless, tasting absolutely nothing. Mabel trying, but surely a lost cause. Her title defence coming to an end. Olive taking everything. Nothing left but the bowl to lick now. And Mabel, well, doesn't seem too upset. A bit of class there from the youngster, generous in what will surely be defeat, because Olive has won now. She's taken the title back at 7.5. Mabel looking to offer congratulations again to the dog who was her inspiration growing up. Once more, wonderful to see that spirit in the game. What a final we've had here. Great rivals, but great friends. And you see the swapping of bowls at the end. Join us again tomorrow. Live coverage of a snooze on the sofa, possibly. Bye for now.
Andrew Cotter with his dogs Olive and Mabel. You can see pictures of them on his Twitter feed, Andrew Cotter. Well, that brings us to our main world news. Once again, the leading infectious disease expert in the US has warned the coronavirus could kill up to 200,000 Americans. In the past half hour, the New York State governor has said 237 people died in his state in the past day, taking the total there to 965. And that is it for now from the newsroom.
This is the BBC World Service, where the incredible story of the doomed Apollo 13 moon mission continues.
The flight of the Apollo 13 to the moon is in serious jeopardy this morning and is not going to make a moon landing. And this is indeed the gravest emergency probably yet in the American space program.
Apollo 13 is approaching the 4th day of its ill-fated flight. 9 hours ago, an explosion crippled their command module. They have battled against failing systems and a dying spacecraft ever since. Their life support and power are running out.
You know, I could tell as soon as I walked in the room that it was serious. The looks on their faces were enough.
It's now all about creating what opportunities they can from moment to moment.
Apollo 13 with Kevin Fong, Wednesday at 10:30 and 21:30 GMT.
On the BBC World Service in just a few minutes.
It's a great dream to have. I mean, to open your own business and to have it be a brewery, I mean, you become everybody's best friend when you make beer.
On the food chain this week, we hear from 3 craft beer fanatics who turned their love of the amber nectar into money-making ventures. But transforming a hobby into a business isn't as easy as you may think. That's all after the news.
BBC News with Aaron Safir. The US government's leading infectious disease expert, Dr. Anthony Fauci, says up to 200,000 Americans could be killed by the coronavirus. He told the CNN TV network that millions of people in the US would catch COVID-19. The United States has recorded more cases of the virus than any other country, 120,000. The 2 European countries hardest hit by the coronavirus pandemic, Italy and Spain, say they believe they are experiencing or nearing the peak of the outbreak. Italy, where more than 10,000 people have died, says it expects a significant drop in cases within 10 days. The British government says the whole country has been put on an emergency footing in the face of the pandemic, something unprecedented in peacetime. Strategic coordination centres are being established across the land. India has told its state governments to seal their borders and quarantine hundreds of thousands of migrants from other parts of the country to try to contain the spread of the coronavirus. A 3-week nationwide lockdown has resulted in a mass exodus of migrant labourers from cities. A pro-government militia in Nigeria says at least 5 people have been killed by jihadists near the northeastern city of Maiduguri. They said the gunmen stopped vehicles on the road, attacking passengers and drivers with machetes. 2 football matches have been taking place in the Belarusian Premier League, which has attracted a new international following as the only European league to play on through the pandemic. Belarus's Football Federation has signed broadcast deals with sports networks in 10 countries. And a video of an Italian intensive care doctor playing the piano after a long shift has been shared widely on social media. Still in his protective suit and mask, Dr. Christian Mongiardi is seen playing Don't Stop Me Now by the British rock band Queen. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to the food chain from the BBC World Service. I'm Tamsin Ford. It's an unprecedented time as coronavirus derails people's lives all over the world. So before we start this week's show, we wanted to let you know that from next week, this programme will be exploring in detail how the pandemic is affecting global food supply chains and how we might feel the knock-on impacts for months to come. We also want to hear from you about what cooking and eating in lockdown has been like. How has COVID-19 forced you, your family and your community to change what and how you eat? I'll let you know details of how you can get in touch with us at the end of the show. But for this week, we are bringing you one last story we planned before the crisis took hold. Feel free to grab a drink, as today we are talking craft beer. We meet the people who turned their love of the amber nectar into a business.
It was a lemon pink peppercorn saison, and our secret ingredient was we added glitter to it. And people went absolutely, it was amazing. Everybody just went crazy for it. It was so much fun.
The number of craft beer breweries in the last decade has exploded. In the US alone, they have more than quadrupled. In Europe, the other major market, the number of new product launches has almost doubled since 2013. But making your own beer isn't as easy as you may think.
I think we had one person describe it as drain pour, which is a fairly derogatory term for a
Yeah, I'd say that's fairly derogatory. How does your taste for the malty brew change once it becomes a full-time job?
With my knowledge, I'm now a better drinker. I can choose better what I ask to the waiter in a bar or a pub. I can know what I expect when I see a beer label at the supermarket. That's the point. You can be a better consumer and demand better beers from the markets.
This week, we speak to 3 craft brewers who threw everything, money, time and love, into launching their own breweries.
My name's John Cockley, and I previously ran a brewery called Old Friends Brewery in Cambridge in the UK. Unsurprisingly, ran that with an old friend. And these days, I'm an illustration agent.
My name is Carol Wagner, and we're with the Bold Missy Brewery, based here in Charlotte, North Carolina, in the United States. And currently, I still have a day job, so I'm still keeping the lights on at home as a salesperson for Campbell's Soup Company.
Hi there, my name is Sérgio Fraga. I live in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, where I used to run the Cervejaria Fraga, in English, Fraga Brewery. And now I work for the IT area as a system developer.
Now, you've all got fascinating stories of why and how you started your own breweries and failed, but you had incredible successes along the way. John, let's start with you. You were already running a successful illustration agency when you started up your second business. What led you into the world of making beer?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me it started with a conversation with a school friend, a close friend of mine, and we were having sort of Sunday lunch. We had some craft beer, and we were just talking really about could we make this? Would it be possible for us to have a go at this? And it kind of just sparked from there really, and it became once we'd kind of done the basic created some beer that was kind of drinkable, we started to kind of push that conversation, I guess, and talk about how we could brand it and how we could market it. And we felt that we live in a town here in Cambridge which was at the time lacking in any craft beer movement. And we just kind of came to the conclusion that despite all of the all of the reasons not to do it, we decided that we were well placed, and if no one else was going to do it here, then we should give that a try.
So it really came out of your love of beer.
Yeah, I think so, and I think it was also the urge. I mean, what I do is a day job I enjoy very much, but it's predominantly screen-based, sending digital files, So it's, I guess also a desire to do something with my hands, to make something tangible and something that you can actually experience and enjoy.
And Carol, what about you? I mean, you've got a history of working in the brewery business, so it wasn't such a leap for you. It wasn't so much, I love beer and therefore I'm going to make it. Give us a bit of background of what got you into it.
Yeah, sure. I had worked for Anheuser-Busch for about 10 years, and when InBev came in and bought Anheuser-Busch, you know, the Brazilians, no offense there to my counterpart on the phone, but it was a Brazilian-Belgian company, InBev, that bought Anheuser-Busch. I was restructured out. So I went to work for a small snack food company at the time, and I was on a pub crawl in a part of town that had a lot of small craft breweries, and I kind of had a aha moment and said, this is what I want to do. I really want to open my own craft brewery because I love being in the beer business. There's no more fun to be had than being in the beer business.
But loving a beer and making a beer are two very different things, aren't they?
Absolutely, yeah, but it goes both ways. You know, I started out as a home brewer and brewed batches of beer in my kitchen with a good friend of mine. She would sit there and drink, and I would sit there and make the beer. And it goes back to that genuine experience of, hey, I am the one who's made this beer. I am, you know, put my heart and soul and love into it, and then to be able to share it with another person is phenomenal.
Sergio, we're talking about how the love of beer got both Carol and John into making beer. But for you, Brazil doesn't have such a history of beer that you find in North America and in Europe. So what got you into the world of beer?
Well, in 1990, I was in Europe for a month trip and entered a pub in London and asked for a beer. The guy replied to me, do you want really a beer or English ale? And I never heard about this. So I asked the ale to taste, and the taste was just amazing for me. I never had ever drank something like this before. In Brazil, we had, at that time, just American style lagers. So when I come back, I try to study, buying some books and reading about the subject of craft beer. Or for me, at that time, I was used to call the real beers. I started making beer in my home, and some years later, a friend of mine that had some money to invest proposed me to open the brewery.
And Sergio, do you think you fully realise what you were letting yourself in for? Can you sort of look back and see where you went wrong?
We faced some problems with Brazilian bureaucracy. In fact, we spent 6 years to really open the brewery. It was a great time. We enjoyed the party. We became famous in Brazil, but we did not have enough money and energy to continue the project after 4 years. So we closed the brewery in 2017.
So when you talk about money, we're talking about the equipment, obviously. We're talking about the space that has to have certain dimensions and heights. When it comes to making a beer, I think some may be able to understand how you could do it in your garage, but when you're upscaling to something like this, John, give us an idea of the mechanics involved in actually making the beer.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think it very much is a volume-based business, and that's where, you know, that's kind of where you make your money. I mean, to give you some real money examples, we used to work out that our beer was costing us around 80 pence a bottle to make, and that was not factoring in even our time. And then we were able to sell that for £1.65 a bottle here in the UK. So not a huge amount of profit, but the people we were selling it to were selling it on for, you know, £4.50, £5. I think one hotel here in Cambridge was selling our beer at £5.50 for a bottle. So that just goes to show you really that there's not a huge amount of profit per bottle, and that really if you're going to scale up, you either need volume or you need to be selling direct.
And we all like a salary, don't we?
and you know, if you really look into that volume business and you look at selling into the big bar chains and of course supermarkets, then that margin comes down, you know, much further even. So yeah, it's all about volume, and obviously with more volume you need more space. You know, you need more space, your rent goes up. So yeah, the equations become quite scary if you really want to go for it.
So does that mean that impossible then to really make a profit out of craft beer, because it's the whole point of craft beer is that it's a small scale venture that's never really going to make a lot of money.
I think here in the UK it's interesting. There's a few, I won't name specific brands, but there's a few brands that kind of purport to be craft beers, but when you actually kind of scratch below the surface, they did have significant backing from day one. I mean, of course, it is possible to make it, but you need to take a bigger leap of faith. I think you need investment. You would need investors.
Carol, turning to you on that, is it possible to make money from craft beer?
Oh, absolutely. I wouldn't have gotten into it if I didn't think I could make some money off of it. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I think that the thing that you've got to remember is it's not necessarily the challenges of craft beer, it's the challenges of being an entrepreneur. And, you know, that takes time and money. And so when you're going into the beer business, you are starting a brand from scratch and gaining that awareness and getting your name out there and competing with the person down the street. And the person down the street might not be playing by the same rules that you are as far as regulations go. There's a lot to it. And so, you know, typical startup businesses, it takes 3 to 5 years to grow that brand and get up and over the hump. And the game is not to run out of working capital until you get there. So for us, I think there were several challenges for sure. Number one, when I started the project, there were 8 breweries in town. And now in Charlotte, there's well over 30 and probably 50 in the surrounding market. So a lot of folks go to where it's shiny and new, and so you're constantly trying to get the attention of customers and consumers. So that's a big challenge. Then on top of that, you've got to, try to drive that brand awareness to get out into the bars and restaurants. Again, it's very cutthroat to get those tap handles at these restaurants. It's tough to get shelf space in the grocery stores. And so for us, I think it was a lot of things around the competition. I think it was a lot of things around the location that we had. Breweries here have turned into a very similar model to restaurants where it's location, location, location. It's not necessarily build it and they will come, which was the model when I first got into it. And it's capital intensive. I mean, you look at the equipment that all of us have had to purchase to support this business, it's all stainless steel. So by the time you pay back your loan on the equipment and then you do 2 payrolls a month, on top of whatever your rent is, there's very little to work with as far as, keeping everything going and spending money on marketing. Our marketing budget was zero. I had got a loan from the bank. I put in my personal savings, as well as during this time frame, I lost my dad. So I was put my inheritance into this thing too, to keep it rolling. And so, then you try to seek out investors. But when you go for investors, we had one investor early on, and I really got a bad taste in my mouth with what that looks like when you have somebody that's not on the same page as you. And then also, or you give up equity of your company and it's all your blood, sweat, and tears, and it's painful to give ownership to somebody else that just walks in and takes it from you because they can write you a check. So for us, it really it came down to running out, not making any money for 3 years was rough, and just really running out of working capital. And I really had a vision of what the future would look like if we did take on investors. It would take a lot of the fun and genuine, authentic experiences out of it, which is why I got into it in the first place.
Did you have any brutal reviews?
Absolutely, and it kills you,
And what sort of things did they say?
I think we had one person describe it as drain poor, which is a fairly derogatory term for a
Yeah, I'd say that's fairly derogatory.
Yeah, it's something that really taught me, especially for my job that I do that's ongoing, which is as an art agent, is that feedback can be really kind of crushing and brutal, and sometimes you need to soften it a little bit.
You're listening to The Food Chain from the BBC World Service with me, Tamsin Ford. This week, we've brought together 3 craft beer fanatics who turned their love of the amber nectar into a business. Carol Wagner from Charlotte in the US, Sergio Fraga from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and John Cockley from Cambridge here in the UK. But being a great beer drinker doesn't necessarily mean you can turn it into a profit-making business.
So, very specifically for us, we were never on draft. We were always bottling beer. We were hand labelling, hand bottling, stamping our bottles, which was very, very time consuming. And we made the decision that we were going to have a go at canning. So we spoke to a number of mobile canning units, which are companies that will come to you. And long story short, we had the capacity of our brewery was too small for their minimum order. So what we did to overcome that was we brewed 4 times in the space of 48 hours, which was back-to-back 8-hour brews. Very little sleep had, just to produce the volume we needed. And then these guys turned up to can the beer. They canned about 25% of it, and they decided that actually they couldn't use our facility, and it wasn't working, and we had to then ship the beer up to them, and they canned it on site. But by that point, the beer was, probably past its best freshness-wise.
Wow, so you lost the lot.
So we lost a lot of beer. But I mean, one of the problems you have with beer as well is that you sometimes you don't realise there's a problem until it's out there in the market. So you'll kind of obviously you're testing, but if you've got 4 different batches that go out there, and some of the beer had been overcarbonated as well by them. So a couple of weeks later, you're getting reports of people saying, "Oh, your beer's usually great, but I bought a can and it as soon as I opened it, it just fizzed up everywhere." So yeah, as a result, we ended up having to pour away a lot of that canned beer, and for us, that financially was a big hit. And I think it also damaged our reputation a little bit because we had beer out there in the marketplace before we could recall it that wasn't up to our usual standards.
Sergio, is there one thing that you can pinpoint that led to your decision to close your brewery?
Oh, certainly was the lack of support of the government. We are paying so high taxes, something just like above 50%, 52% of taxes. The legislation is so tough, and so we cannot be creative because there's some restrictions.
What about the mega breweries? Did you feel the heat from them?
The mega breweries, they pay less taxes proportionally, because they employ a lot of people, so the government preferred to give fiscal advantage for them.
Carol, did you feel a threat from the mega breweries in the States?
Oh yes, absolutely. Because in the United States, they call it a 3-tier system, where in some states you have to go through a distributor to get your beers out to the market. So if you've got a distributor in town that carries the mega breweries, they're only going to carry a handful of the small craft beers, because they're going to go where the money is and stuff. So they're not going to take as great a care of your brand as they will of other bigger breweries. So it's pretty notorious at how the mega brewers can push out the small guys. And also, I think he made a great point about the taxes. One thing that you really face with beer is the taxes. There's a tax to make the beer, there's a tax to sell the beer, there's a tax of the federal government, and then there's the state government, and then there's the city tax. And then on top of that, you really have to think about your insurance, because you've got to insure your equipment and where you are. And there's even an insurance that we have to carry. It's called dram shop liability insurance. So if somebody drinks too much at your brewery and they go out and kill somebody with their car, you can turn around and be sued for that. So that's another type of insurance you have. So insurance and taxes is something that's definitely very unique to the alcohol industry that can really take a bite out of your profitability.
So we've heard about the craft beer explosion over the last decade. Why are so many people going into it then, John, if it's so easy to fail?
Well, there's just so many people out there that love beer.
So it comes from the love of beer?
I think it comes from essentially a love of beer. There's a product that everybody enjoys. It's very, everyman product that's very shareable. And just the chance, I think, in an increasingly digital world to make something tangible that can be shared with friends is something that appeals.
Carol?
I would say people are still getting into it because it's a great dream to have. I mean, to open your own business and to have it be a brewery, I mean, you become everybody's best friend when you make beer. And it is just great fun. And I would, even though, ours did not take off the way I thought it should,
I would encourage anybody that has a dream to open one to go for it. It's the ride of a lifetime, and it is fantastic.
Sergio, you went into this after that first taste of beer in a London pub nearly 30 years ago. Do you feel differently about craft beer from going from a drinker to a brewer to now back to a drinker again?
With my knowledge, I'm now a better drinker. I can choose better what I ask to the waiter in a bar or a pub. I can know what I expect when I see a beer label at the supermarket. So I can.
The sommelier of beers, then, Sergio.
Yeah, my wife is a sommelier. I'm not, but.
So you make a great couple to go out with.
Yeah, we work together very well. So I think that's the point. You can be a better consumer and demand better beers from the markets.
Is it that the market has become too crowded because of the boom, John?
I think that's a nice thing, especially here in the UK, though. You know, if you go to a new town or a new city, you should be able to find a local beer, and I think that's almost perhaps a return to how it was in years gone past. But yeah, there's no doubting it is a very crowded market, and we certainly felt that if we were to move out of Cambridge, you know, I think we worked in this town because we were a local beer. You know, as soon as we took our beer out of the city, what did it really mean to anyone outside of Cambridge? And that was the big challenge for us if we were to grow.
The big question I want to ask, Sergio, is would you do it all again?
Oh, sure, yes. I will do it again, but not here in Brazil. I think I will prefer a place that gives more support for the beer entrepreneurs and for the craft beer segment, maybe in Europe.
John, would you do it again, or are you back to a garage making beer person?
Yeah, I think one thing I've learned from this is not to make your hobbies a business. So I think I would stick to making beer for fun. I'm probably better at drinking it than making it.
And if you were to do this all over again, what is there one thing that you would do differently, Sergio?
I think I will not try to struggle with the beer consumers' education. I will not try to, let me say what they need to drink. I think I will hear more from the markets what they really want, in spite of what I like to drink personally.
So you think the Brazilian palate just wasn't ready for your beer?
No, you are some centuries behind you. Yes.
And John, if you could do one thing differently, what would it be?
I wouldn't have canned our beer.
Right. That was the moment, was it, that you were really like, okay, this is the end of us?
That was the moment. I mean, yeah, I think for us as well, you know, I really don't regret doing something that meant hanging out with one of my best mates for kind of 3 or 4 years and just having a go at something.
And do any of you have any of the beers still hanging around? Have you put them in a shelf somewhere where you'll keep them forever and look at them?
I have a couple of empty bottles in my office behind me, but unfortunately there's no actual beer left.
Sergio?
I drank the last bottle last month, but it was not good. It was a Weiss beer. It's a kind of beer that doesn't age well.
Oh no, so it wasn't even very good.
No, it was a terrible flavor, unfortunately.
Carol, do you have any of your beers left? Have you put any in a case that you'll keep forever to remind you?
No, I mean, you know, the thing about the Bold Missy is we had incredible brand imagery and design. Like a lot of our labels in our products were like mid-century modern, almost like Pulp Fiction, paperback novel kind of imagery. So really, I own that still. So I own the trademarks and I own the imagery. So for me, the Bold Missy is going to, rise from the ashes into something else.
Carol, anything you would do differently? If there's one thing, if you could do this all over again, is there one thing that you would do differently?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I made a million mistakes. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And then if you talk to any small business owner, entrepreneur, they'll tell you the same thing, is that you make a million mistakes and there's a lot of ways I could have done things differently. At the end of the day, it's all about the journey. And, we were on this amazing journey together. So I really wouldn't change anything because everything led to something else.
That's all for this week. Thanks to my guests, Carol Wagner, Sergio Fraga and John Cockley. Now, as you heard at the top of the show, we want to hear from you on coronavirus and whether it's changing your relationship with food. COVID-19 has completely rocked people's lives around the globe. Tell us about your experiences of cooking and eating in lockdown. Have you turned to video dinners to stay in touch with your families? What about cooking with your children? How do you even manage to get food into your house? Are you a farmer or a shopkeeper? It could be any detail, no matter how big or small. We'd love to hear from you. Please email us on thefoodchain@bbc.co.uk or get in touch with me on Twitter @Tamasim_Ford or our regular presenter @Greya Jackson. And why not post your lockdown dinner pictures on Instagram using the hashtag BBC Food Chain. From me and the rest of the team, Sarah Stollars, Simon Tulitt and Greya Jackson, thanks for listening and join us again next week.
This is the BBC World Service, where we're navigating the world through sound.
I'm Peter White, and in Sounds of the City, we're exploring what I, born blind, can hear, taste, touch, and smell of the places I visit.
You can be walking the streets and you can be listening to somebody speak Creole, French, German, Brazilian.
In the first episode, I'm taking my tape recorder to Miami.
Sounds of the City, Tuesday at 12:30 and 21 GMT. Hello and a warm welcome to the BBC World Service. Normally at this time, we'd be heading back to Sports World. However, due to the global spread of coronavirus, we have made some changes to our schedule. Stay with us from our own correspondent. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station. On from our own correspondent after this bulletin, how a stringent approach in Singapore is helping contain the coronavirus.
Contact tracing in particular, hunting down people who've been in contact with an infected person and then isolating them, has been credited for the government's success.
In California, authorities grapple with how to protect the homeless.
Los Angeles County just converted 42 closed recreation centers into emergency homeless shelters. Boom, 6,000 beds.
And in Iraq, the protest movement that's still juddering along.
What remains of the protests has morphed into something that is part carnival, part memorial, and part violent political struggle.
All that and the 1940s novel that still resonates today in Bulgaria. On from our own correspondent, after this bulletin, BBC World News.
Hello, I'm Aaron Safir with the BBC News. The US government's leading infectious disease expert, Dr. Anthony Fauci, says at least 100,000 Americans will be killed by the coronavirus and possibly up to twice that number. Some cities, including New York, have warned that they may soon run out of medical supplies. Our North America correspondent Peter Bowes reports.
The current death toll in the US is about 2,200. The number has doubled in the past 2 days. Around the country, there are more than 125,000 cases, but Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, said millions could eventually be infected. Citing extensive community transmission, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has said people living in New York, New Jersey and Connecticut should refrain from non-essential travel for 14 days, effective immediately.
The country that's registered the highest number of fatalities in the coronavirus pandemic, Italy, has seen a drop in the daily number of people dying. 756 people died in the last 24 hours. It's the second consecutive daily fall since Friday's worst figure yet. The number of new cases has risen, but at a slower rate. Earlier, the